administration, public policy, government law, and criminology. Our faculty conduct research, contribute to dialogue on important policy issues, and engage in the most pressing public affairs issues of the day. Now, for 25 years, our Justice Programs Office has been working to ensure fair administration of justice in criminal and civil legal matters. The Justice Programs Office is one that we are especially proud of in the School of Public Affairs. It is one of our most successful and long-standing programs. Now, it's partly because the issue is enduring, right? It hasn't gone away. It changes its shape and the issues change, but the important issues of justice are with us always. Now, the issues that JPO has been focused on are especially fair administration of justice in criminal and civil legal matters. And what they have been focusing on is drug use, juvenile crimes, military veterans, right to counsel, as well as criminal justice reform, which is what we're focused on today. So throughout the day, you're going to be talking about reducing the number of people in America's jails and prisons. It's a justice issue, it's an economic issue, it's a management issue. You'll consider multiple trigger points in the criminal justice system and examine how decisions made at one stage can dramatically impact down the line the mass incarceration that we have today. So we hope you will consider changes that can be made to alleviate this problem and still maintain that balance between justice and safety and security for our communities. Now, Kim shared with me some troubling statistics that I want to share with you. I can't claim that these are at the top of my head, but she was good enough to point out the staggering statistics that tell us why this is so important. 2.3 million people in prison right now, 3,000 in local jails, 1,700 in state prisons. That we have 1,700 state prisons, 100 federal prisons, and more than 900 juvenile correctional facilities. It's a major industry. We also have military prisons, immigration detention facilities, jails on Indian reservations, civil commitment centers, and U.S. territory prisons. That's just too many people locked up. And what's worse, the research tells us that they don't need to be there, that there are other ways to pursue justice without locking people up. So my hope for you today is that what you hear during this session gives you good information to take back. And I know you're here because you're committed to the issue and you want to know more. But these kind of forums allow you to share ideas, to strategize, and to talk about future collaborations that can make even more difference than what your individual efforts can do. So that's why we're so proud of what JPO is doing. That's why we're so proud to partner with this, because it's our job as a School of Public Affairs to make a contribution to our public communities. Nothing rises to that level more than the issues of justice. So it's close to my heart, it's close to our institution's commitment, and it's definitely in the wheelhouse of the Justice Programs Office. So I'm sure you will have a great session today, and I want to thank you for coming, and I look forward to hearing what you're going to take away from this and what the future collaborations are going to bring. Now, I have to apologize. It's our busiest season of the year on the university campus, so I have to go for another meeting. But Kim's going to keep me posted on all that comes out of this, and we look forward to hearing the next steps. Thank you all. Kim?
So the podium was a last-minute addition. And you see, we didn't think of, yes, our logistics. Thank you, Barbara. We really appreciate all the support we get from SPA. The statistics that Barbara was referring to is from the Prison Policy Institute, Mass Incarceration, the Whole Pie. And there was a copy out on the resource table, and we'll be referring to this during the day some. Just a few housekeeping items. In your folders, there's a sheet about social media. And so please tweet during the day. We also, I know Sharice will be tweeting. We also have live stream, so send it out to anyone that wasn't able to make it, and then you can watch on live stream. And then our hashtag, as you see, is AU Redefine, which I was very pleased with. Our staff came up with that. I think it's very catchy and a way for us to keep the conversation going. Also, there are note cards, and so during the day on the panels, please write down your questions, and they'll be collected, and then we'll have the moderator read the questions at the end. And that way, we won't have to interrupt the panel, and you won't forget your question. So our sponsors, we'd like to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Where's Thurston? There we go. I couldn't find you. Oh, we wanted people to come down and not sit on that back row. So during a break, if you can, move on. Oh, Aisha, yes. Come down here. Don't be afraid. Yes, thank you very much. And is Andre here? Oh, you're in the back too. So my fellow BJA colleagues are sitting in the back. But thank you very much for coming and for sponsoring. One of the grants we work on is with BJA, with state and state policymakers. We'd like to thank JLC, Justice Law and Criminology, for also helping sponsor. I see John Gould is here from that school. Joe Young will be joining us at some time today. He's the head of that department. And then also the Excellence with Impact is a program at American University that is sponsoring this event. And so we're very fortunate to have them giving us money to talk about this issue. I'd like to give a big thank you to the Justice Programs Office staff. Two people in particular. Tracy Velasquez, I don't know if Tracy is here. This was her idea before I even started at JPO. I've been here 6 months, and this was her idea from the beginning. And then after, I have to tell you, when we thought about it, we really kind of envisioned a different administration. So maintaining momentum had a different look at that time. And so then we had to stop and kind of rethink and see how we changed our message, something we'll talk about today. And then Genevieve Citron-Ray then really was the brainchild of looking at how all this came together in light of all the changes, the curveball we were thrown. So who's in the audience with us today? So students, can I have students raise their hands? You see we have a few students. Faculty, yes. State and local policymakers and practitioners, a good number. National organizations, trade associations, good. And foundations. Foundations, wonderful. Did I forget anyone? Oh, federal government. Yes. Anybody else? Okay, so that gives you a frame of reference of who your audience is, who you're talking to, and then who the questions are coming from. Why is this meeting different? I know there's a lot of meetings on this topic, and some of the people you see you may have heard before, but this meeting is different because we have an amazing opportunity to redefine the purpose of jail and the role of government in the criminal justice system. And that's why it's our hashtag. And we think it's important enough, and we hope that will keep the conversation going. We'll ask this question to some of our experts later. I especially want to dive deep into the role of government in the criminal justice system. This summit is meant to build on the criminal justice conversation that's been going on for the last 8 years. There's been bipartisan support, especially surrounding the issue of incarceration. And I wish my friend Lori Garducki could be here because for a long time, a small group of us, including Sharice Burdine, were really trying to elevate jails into this conversation. Because when it started, everyone was talking about prison. And what this pie chart doesn't tell you is that 11.4 million people rotate out of jails every year. And so when the MacArthur Foundation started the Safety and Justice Challenge and really kind of included jails in the conversation of mass incarceration, it was really a tipping point for us. And I think it's changed the landscape and our ability to talk about that. It also shows how important foundation funding is. Especially as we see funding maybe changing at the federal level, that foundations that work with organizations like ours and other NGOs and really fund around criminal justice and keep the conversation going about what's important. It was a conversation that I was fortunate enough to start at the Department of Justice. I left there 6 months ago and was there for over 17 years. And I'm very excited to be able to continue it today. I was the senior policy advisor there over the adjudication portfolio, and I'm a former prosecutor, and so I bring a lot of that to the discussions and the way I think about things today. Some of the initiatives that I worked very hard on were smart pretrial, procedural fairness, capital case litigation improvement, and particularly the right to counsel. And I strongly believe that we cannot have successful criminal justice reform without early appointment of counsel and effective counsel. And so I hope that that will come into the criminal justice conversation, and that we'll look at all the benefits for human dignity and fiscally that brings to us. So some people say that this conversation started because of the recession and the enormous drain that jails and prisons, incarceration is on state and local budgets. And some would say that our system has reached a capacity like we never thought we would see, and that the criminal justice system has lost the values our country was founded on: fairness, equality, liberty, respect for human dignity, and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. I think we can all agree it's both, and that's why we're here today having this conversation, and why we have bipartisan support for reform. So our work today, and why this meeting is different, we're going to think broader and deeper to keep the momentum going. And when I say broader, we're going to think about the criminal justice system as a continuum and how all these points, the decision points, we weren't able to cover them all, we covered what we could, but how they all impact mass incarceration, and that it's not one point, it's all the points, and that we have to work together. And we're going to go deeper by talking about discretion, something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and really look at how our discretion can and does impact mass incarceration. Capacity, we have all these programs, but how many people are in the programs? If it's 1 or 2, how does that benefit us? Going to scale, and most importantly, redefining the purpose of jail. As you can probably tell, I'm not from Massachusetts, but Arkansas. I got my start a long time ago as an assistant prosecuting attorney in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I know from my time as a prosecutor that everyone that works in the system is doing his or her best job. But it's just that we've reached this ordinary injustice. That term comes from my good friend Amy Bach, who wrote a book about it. And we have to change that. And together I think we can. Amy Bach wants to change it by using measurement. I also think we need to talk about how the system uses discretion to change that ordinary injustice. Examining how we use discretion in the system is the next step, and that will be a big part of our conversation today. To lead off this morning, we have with us Glenn Martin. I'm not going to introduce him. His bio is in your materials. We at JPO recognize the disproportionate impact on communities of color and want to make sure that it's more than just a data point, and we want to bring it to life. It's something that I tried to do at the Department of Justice, is to have demonstration projects look at their data through a racial and ethnic lens. I think a lot of people are talking about it, but I don't know that we're actually acting on it. It's not something we've covered in depth today, but it is something that JPO will look at in the future. Here to give us a firsthand account of that impact is Glenn Martin. Glenn?
Morning. So I don't usually write speeches, actually. I usually just sort of wing it. Today I wrote something early this morning, actually. I woke up around 5 a.m. And so I'm going to read some of this, which is unusual for me, so bear with me. But part of it is that it includes a bit of my own story, and it's never easy to tell your own story, but I think it's important. So first of all, I'm thankful to American University and the Justice Programs Office, School of Public Affairs, for this opportunity. I'm honored to serve as keynote for today. The summit's theme, Maintaining Momentum, Redefining Incarceration in the Ongoing Conversation about Criminal Justice Reform. I was thinking about that theme as I started my writing, and the paradigm shift that we've seen over the last 10 years or so, the efforts that have been made to reverse mass incarceration, many of the people in this room who've been part of that effort, and the need for not just cross-discipline, but bipartisan collaboration, and how that's been an important part of the reforms that we've seen. And the question everyone is asking is, what does the way forward look like, particularly now with the new president in office? My own organization has been asking the same question. People I work with have been asking the same question. The leaders who we train at Just Leadership USA have been asking the same question. And everyone started asking the day after Election Day. So I asked myself this morning, what brought me to this work? And I keep coming back to the same thing, which is people. As someone who served time in prison before I started doing this work, much of what I do is driven by my experience of meeting some of America's best and brightest while I was locked up. And that's not the conversation we have about who we incarcerate in this country, but that was my experience in prison, and it helps to guide the way I do the work. And I thought about a particular story of someone I met in prison named Arthur, and one or two of you may have heard this story before, but it's worth telling. In New York State, when you're in prison and you're being moved from one cell to the other, from one prison to the other, you tend to stay in prisons in different places in between. A 10-hour trip can take days, especially if it happens on the weekend. And I was traveling from one facility to the other on a Friday, and I ended up at Auburn Correctional Facility, which is the second oldest correctional facility in New York. And it's everything you would imagine a scary prison would look like: really tall walls and high guard towers and huge metal gates that slam behind the bus. And we're all coming in and we're shackled. And when we get to the prison, we're walking side by side shackled. There's about 40 of us. And we get to these cells. And as they start taking the shackles off, they tell you to walk into the cells. And at the time, our prisons were double bunked because of over-incarceration in New York. And so as soon as I walked into the cell, there was someone else in that cell. And it was really dark. Again, it's this really old prison with the paint peeling and everything else. And I quickly realized that this guy is talking to himself as I walk into the cell. And I figure, when you're in a moment like that where you're scared, your best bet is probably to just start talking to the person and get a sense of who you're with. And I knew I'd be with him for the weekend. So I introduced myself. He introduced himself. His name was Arthur. And we just started talking and getting to know each other. And I learned that he grew up in the Bronx. And he grew up in a really poor family, not different than my circumstance growing up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. He was Latino. His dad was in and out of prison. His uncles were in and out of prison. They were selling drugs. By the age of 10, he was smoking cigarettes, and by the age of 12, he was smoking marijuana, and by the age of 13, he was selling crack cocaine. And at the age of 16, he got arrested for trafficking crack cocaine in the city. And he was facing a mandatory minimum under our New York State Rockefeller drug laws, which are our mandatory minimum drug laws at the time. And in New York, if you're 16, you get charged as an adult. So at the age of 16, locked up, he had to make a decision, a pretty adult decision, I would argue, about how to handle the charges against him. And he decided to take a plea. He decided not to take a plea, decided to take it to trial. And the plea was 15 years to life, and he decided there's no way he could take 15 years to life and that he would go to trial. And he ended up with 25 to life. And so when I met him, he was 34. He had been in since he was 16. I was there for a robbery. I'd be there 6 years. He was serving 25 years for drugs. As we got to know each other, I realized he was getting Thorazine through the cell from the correction officers. He had a mental health issue, and they were giving him medication through the cells. He said he got addicted to heroin while he was in prison, continued to smoke marijuana. There's obviously a lot of access to drugs in correctional settings, so people who don't know that. After about a day, the correction officers would leave the windows open on the cells, like these windows, And so as you can imagine, in the middle of winter in New York, it got really cold in those cells, and all you have is a really thin blanket. And when I get sick, my glands start swelling first, and I just know I'm going to get sick, and sore throat and everything else that comes with it. And he notices that I'm coughing over and over, and on Saturday, he turns to me and he says, "Do you want me to make you a cup of tea?" When I walked into the cell, he was talking to himself. So I'm saying, "Okay, Arthur, sure. I want to make me a cup of tea in this cell." And he just sprung into action. He jumped up, and he asked me to look out for the correction officer, and he grabbed a plastic bottle that was in the cell, and he filled it with water. And he took a string, and he tied the top of the bottle to a light fixture, and he took the mattress off the bunk, which exposed the metal part of the bunk, and he asked me to grab the toilet tissue, and he spun it really tightly. And he took a pencil that was in the cell, and he used the lead in the pencil and the electrical outlet to heat the lead in the pencil and light the tissue on fire. And the bottle hovered just above the flame. And the bottle began to melt, but it didn't burst. And then the water in the bottle began to boil. And as it did, he took it down off the string, and he ripped open the collar of his prison outfit, and he pulled out 2 tea bags, and he put one of them in the bottle, and he handed it to me, and he said, "Here, a cup of tea." So why do I tell that story? As I wrote my speech this morning, that story reminded me of the humanity of the people I met in prison. Here's a guy who arguably should have had his hopes and dreams and everything else just crushed by our criminal justice system, and yet in a matter of 24 hours, in a place like Auburn Correctional Facility, in one of the most disgusting spaces I've ever spent any time in my life, he found enough compassion to make me a cup of tea in that horrible situation. And our criminal justice system operates the way it does now because we've done an excellent job of dehumanizing the people who are in that system. And until we spend some time reminding ourselves of the humanity of every single person who comes into contact with that system, whether they're victim or offender, I don't think we make much progress on criminal justice reform. I think we stay mired in incrementalism. I think our solutions don't end up matching the scope of the problem. So I wanted to begin with that story to help shape the rest of my comments and to add some context to these comments. So Just Leadership USA, the organization that I founded, was founded on the principle that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from power and resources. Centering the work around human beings has to be central to reducing mass incarceration and achieving Just Leadership's goal of cutting the number of people under correctional supervision in this country in half by 2030. At the same time, the data and the research are important, especially if we're being intellectually honest about the story being told by the data. Stories about people may be anecdotal, but the data is only a compilation of those anecdotal stories. There's no doubt that we're in a new era now in terms of our political climate. And those of us concerned about these issues must fortify ourselves for the challenges that lay ahead. But first, let's take a step back and look at where we've been, how we created this human gristmill in the first place, and what progress has been made to reverse mass incarceration. For 4 decades, the U.S. experienced an unprecedented expansion in its criminal justice system. According to the National Academy of Sciences, by 2012, the number of people in jails and prisons had ballooned to more than 2.2 million people, a figure nearly 7 times the jail and prison population in 1972. This increase in the number of people incarcerated was paralleled by similar growth in the population under other forms of correctional supervision, like parole and probation and electronic monitoring and so on. All told, by 2010, more than 7 million U.S. residents were under some form of correctional control, a figure that represents 1 in 33 adults. This expansion was not the result of an uptick in crime, but instead was a manifestation of the get tough rhetoric that ramped up policing and prosecution and reflected a penchant for punishment. Beginning in the 1960s, the criminal justice net had stretched to encompass a variety of perceived social problems, including mental health, drug abuse, domestic violence, and more recently, school misbehavior. The widening criminal justice system now includes millions of people whose behavior would not have been considered criminal just 30 or 40 years ago. For example, A study by the American Bar Association found that an astonishing 40% of federal crimes enacted since the Civil War were passed into law between 1970 and 1998. Despite this net widening and expanding of correctional control, crime rates themselves have been steadily declining for decades, for both violent and property crimes. Violent crime is half of what it was when it peaked in 1991, according to the FBI. Data from the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics register a 26% drop in violent crimes and 22% drop in property crimes in the period from 2008 to 2015 alone. Americans are now less likely to be the victim of a crime than they were 10, 20, or even 30 years ago. In recent years, the incarceration spree has begun to reverse course thanks to efforts from community groups, researchers, think tanks, directly impacted people, and advocates. State prison populations began declining in 2009, and by 2014, 24 states had reduced the number of people in their prisons, outpacing the continued growth in several other states, according to the Department of Justice. One driving force is the decline is that between 2009 and 2013, 40 states took some action to ease their drug laws, according to the Pew Research Center. Many have increased opportunities to divert people charged with other low-level offenses away from the criminal justice system as well. This new approach to crime was adopted not only in traditionally progressive states like New York, New Jersey, and California, but also in conservative states like Texas and Arkansas. According to the Sentencing Project, in 2016 alone, 17 states adopted reforms targeted at reducing prison populations and addressing collateral consequences for people with criminal records. Sentencing reforms included initiatives like rolling back 3 strikes laws, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, and reclassifying certain felony offenses as misdemeanors. The federal system was slow to catch up to state reforms, however, but for the first time since 1981, the federal prison population began declining under the Obama administration. From 2009 to 2015, the number of people in federal prison decreased by 5%, reversing the trend of steady increases throughout the previous administrations. These policy shifts are consistent with shifts in public opinion. According to the Pew Research Center, 2/3 of Americans think that the government should focus more on treatment for people using illegal drugs, compared with only 26% who think the focus should be on prosecuting people caught with drugs. Attitudes have similarly shifted with respect to people convicted of violent crimes, away from punitiveness toward prevention, rehabilitation, and reintegration. And these opinions are consistent across race, gender, age, region, and even party lines. 2/3 of Americans agree that, quote, people who have committed serious crimes can turn their lives around and move away from a life of crime with the right kind of help. Even victims themselves of violent crimes favor rehabilitation over punishment by a margin of 2-1. According to a landmark study released last year by the Alliance for Safety and Justice. And 69% think we should consider options other than incarceration to hold people accountable for violent crimes, compared to only 25% who advocate prison. Victims of violent crimes widely support reducing incarceration to invest in prevention and rehabilitation. I want to slow down here for a second around this conversation about people convicted of violent crimes. Because as someone who served time in the system again, I met all sorts of people. And when you're in prison, you rarely talk about why you're in prison. It's just sort of part of the rules of being incarcerated is that you don't ask someone else why they're there. And so you take people at face value. You learn about people based on their actions, their entire identity, and your ability to trust them and develop a relationship is actually based on just about everything else but the criminal conviction. And as someone who went to prison and met some pretty interesting opportunities, which I'll talk about in a second, I spent a lot of time learning from other people who are in prison And, you know, in some cases, I ultimately found out why they were there, sometimes after my own release. And sometimes it was for some of the most heinous crimes, some of the most serious crimes, some of the most violent crimes. But none of that mattered when someone was helping me to get my GED, or when someone was helping me to write to my parents, or work through a difficult situation that was happening at home, or prepare for a college entrance exam while I was in prison. And none of that matters to me now as I run the organization that I run. I mean, we've trained 222 formerly incarcerated people in 26 states plus DC, and usually the last thing I learn about these people is what they went to prison for in the first place. We train people who served anywhere from 3 years on probation to 40 years in prison. And I think that's worth re-emphasizing as we have this discussion, because I've been in the space for 15 years now. I came out of prison, couldn't find a job just like anyone else with a criminal record. I mean, people look at me now and they're like, oh, look at Glenn, he's the exception. But if I am the exception, it's because I've been exposed to exceptional opportunities. And one of those opportunities was to land at the front desk of a public interest law firm with an office in New York and one here in DC, answering the phones, and to learn from some of the most amazing and thoughtful and compassionate civil rights attorneys that I've met up until today. And I found myself in many spaces where high-level policy reform conversations were happening, legislative reform conversations were happening, and I was sitting next to my colleagues who were articulating who was deserving of opportunities and who wasn't. And I often found myself on the wrong side of that conversation. I found myself as one of the people they were defining as not deserving of opportunities. And yet here I was in the flesh, sitting next to them. And as you can imagine, there were many opportunities to shift those conversations. But I continue to strongly believe that every single human being can redeem themselves, can transform themselves, and that we're not even having an intellectually honest conversation about why we lock people up in the first place, or the system that is in place that tracks people into that system. So I wanted to stop for a second on the binary between nonviolent and violent. I mean, the last thing I'd say about that before I go back to the written speech is there's a thin line between who ends up in prison for violent and who ends up for nonviolent. I mean, when I think of my behavior between the age of 16 and 23, when I ultimately got locked up for the crime that where I ended up with 6 years, I mean, whether I was in the system for violent or nonviolent depend on which day the police pulled me over, to be quite honest. Because one day they might find drugs in the car while I was with a friend, and the other day they might have found a Ruger 9mm P9 16-shot, one in the clip handgun. It all depended on which day. And yet, once people end up in the system, they get the label of either nonviolent or violent, and we track them. Like every other system, you know, when it gets unwieldy, we label things and we send them on their way. And that's how our criminal justice system operates these days, a system that has criminalized 70 million Americans. I mean, how else can that system operate without us figuring out how we can put labels on people quickly and sort of send them on their way? So I think we have to close the distance between victim and offender also. I want to dig in here for a second. And we have to do that to match the reality of the complexity of the issue of high crime communities. By definition, high crime, high incarceration communities are also communities that are high in victimization. People don't tend to buy plane tickets to go commit crimes. They commit them in their community, in their neighborhood, on their block, in their building, in their apartment, against themselves. And the thick line that we draw between victim and offender rarely is the reality of the experience of people in the system, depending on the day of the week. In my personal experience and my subsequent work to end mass incarceration, I've come to see our criminal justice system as this gigantic conveyor belt, as I mentioned a second ago. Like a factory conveyor belt, it moves objects, in this case human beings, from one station to the next. The stations in this factory are unforgiving and impersonal. Their goal is to keep things moving and to turn out results. In this case, forms of punishment and punitiveness that don't serve to achieve safety or justice. In order to maximize efficiency in this factory, the objects being moved are identified by labels. And like so much else in the world, the categories are strictly binary. There are victims and there are offenders, and never the twain shall meet. I remember sitting on a panel with Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, a couple of years ago, and we were having a discussion about reentry. I spent 6 years of my career working as the vice president of a large reentry organization. And about 30 minutes into that conversation, Cy Vance, who's a friend and colleague, sort of interrupted me and said, Glenn, you know, we've been speaking for about 30 minutes about reentry and people who committed crimes coming out of the system, and that conversation's important, but we should also be talking about victims. And, you know, it was a moment for me. I've had many moments in my life and my career that helped to shape the way I think about these things, but my visceral reaction to his interruption in that moment was, you know, with all due respect, DA Vance, I didn't learn how to pull out a gun on someone until someone pulled out a gun on me. And when I was a victim, your office wasn't that interested in me as a victim, but when I became the person pulling out the gun, you became extremely interested in me. And we live in a city that spends $209,000 per bed per year locking up people on the offender side of things, and we spend little supporting people who've been harmed by crime. So the problem with these labels is that they conceal a powerful truth, which is that victims and offenders are often from the same communities. In fact, they're often the same people. I didn't always understand this. It took me a long time to realize that my own offender label was preventing me from seeing and understanding my own dual status as a victim who had evolved to cause harm to many other victims. And when I did come to understand that, it only fortified my commitment to ending mass incarceration and the vicious cycle of victimization, trauma, and the calcification of that trauma that sometimes leads to criminal behavior, as it did with me. See, in high crime communities where you have high victimization, you also, by definition, all the data tells us that these are also communities that are least resourced to deal with that victimization, that don't have health care coverage to be able to find a therapist to help you to work through that victimization, that have prosecutors' offices that only now are coming around to recognize that young men of color in particular are the highest victims of violent crime in this country. And you know, with human beings are pretty damn resilient. I've seen human beings in some of the worst situations, and I've seen them survive. And when you live in communities like the one I grew up in, when you become a victim, you sort of hold on to that, and you put it into a cage, and you sort of put it in the back of your mind, and you find a way to move on. The problem, however, is that that stuff doesn't work forever. And the more you feel like a victim and feel as though people are not empathetic to that, is the more that behavior sometimes manifests itself as offending behavior, something that you couldn't explain to me 20 years ago, but something I've learned a lot about since then. Physical violence was an ordinary event for me when I was growing up. I grew up in Bed-Stuy, a poor and under-resourced community in the 70s and 80s. It was a community full of assets, but it was always looked at through a lens of deficits. My first experience with violence was at the hands of my older brother when I was just a small boy. He was very abusive, and every time my mother went out, he would start beating on me and forcing me to fight back. He grew up to be a correction officer. He's now a U.S. Marshal. You can imagine what Thanksgiving is like at my house. In retrospect, giving him the benefit of the doubt, he saw himself as the father figure preparing me for the kinds of dangers that I'd faced growing up as a black man in America. I love my brother. But it was pretty scary knowing that whenever I was home alone with my brother, I'd have to face this sort of abuse. Also, I come from a family where discipline was often physical. If you made a mistake or misbehaved, the response was often a beating. I think they did it from the right place, but it was a tough way to grow up. Out on the streets as a young teenager, I was a crime victim multiple times, but I didn't think of myself as a victim. And it never occurred to me to go to the police or to a prosecutor for support. When you grow up in a predominantly black neighborhood and see your family and friends unfairly targeted by police and prosecutors, you don't see them as people who are on your side. You get used to handling problems on your own, and sometimes violently. People pick up phones and call cops when they think the person on the other end of that phone is going to help them. If everything you've learned from police is the opposite, then you tend not to grab that phone even when you need support. It's part of the lay of the land, and you try your best to avoid being victimized. But if it happens, you just think of it as your turn, and you just plow through it. If you do get through it, you see it not exactly as a badge of honor, but at least as proof of your ability to survive. So by the time I spent my first 2 days on Rikers Island as a 16-year-old, the violence I experienced there, 4 stab wounds inflicted by a writing pen melted and fashioned into a dagger, was something I expected. The 4th wound was here in my neck. You can still see the mark where he left the pen in my neck. The indifference of the correction officers who looked on and laughed solidified for me my belief that authority figures thought my life had no value and they could never be counted on for either protection or justice. That's what New York City taught me at the age of 16. By putting me in a place like Rikers with adults who had been there multiple times, with other children, with $1,500 bail to teach me a lesson. That judge wanted to teach me a lesson. I'd be back in front of that judge 48 hours later with 4 holes in my body. He sure did teach me a lesson. Taught me that there wasn't much you could do to me where I wouldn't be able to survive. That's what he taught me in 48 hours. And this has happened for decades. When you look at the Department of Justice report that came out in 2014 about Rikers, it tells a story about a place that's been referred to as Gladiator School for decades. The story sounded eerily similar to my experience at Rikers decades ago. And when you're taught that you have no value and there is no recourse to injustice, you come to believe that other human beings lack value too. And going from that belief to engaging in criminal behavior is just not that much of a big leap. As a young man, I had this twisted logic that as long as I didn't hurt anyone physically, then I wasn't actually causing harm. It felt like what I was doing to other people was the same thing that other people had done to me. I was reacting to the reality of the black experience in America, that this country abused people of color, stole our labor, devalued us, marginalized us. That thinking shaped the way I interacted with white people, and I didn't have a whole lot of empathy. In my mind, no one had shown me any empathy as a young black man. And as I was just returning, the favor, I figured that if I didn't hurt anyone physically, then it wasn't the worst thing in the world. It wasn't until I was serving time that I began to question my own values. When I arrived in state prison, a correction counselor said to me, "Look at your grades. You should go to college." It was the first time anyone had said that to me, period. I wouldn't recognize that person if they were sitting in a room today. This person planted the seed that grew into a tree that cast shade that he will never enjoy. And I like telling that story because as we think about mass incarceration and how daunting it is and where we've ended up, people often feel paralyzed about what they can do about it as an individual. I'm so glad that this correction counselor didn't feel so paralyzed, that on a day where he was probably going to see 300-400 people going through that conveyor belt, that he took a moment, probably 30 seconds, to say to me, "Look at your grades. You should go to college." I didn't believe it in the moment, but he clearly saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I like telling that story because I think it empowers every single person who can hear my voice. And it reminds you that every single person has an opportunity to turn a life around. When I ask people about things that put them on a new track in their lives, that created opportunity, they rarely talk about a program or anything like that. They talk about people, and that's whether you've been to prison or not. And for me, it was that person who caused significant change in my life. I'll talk a little bit more about what that college experience was like sitting in prison, particularly because, as I'm sure Fred Patrick will talk about when he has a chance to engage, we've stripped that away from people in prison. You know, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided to strip away access to Pell Grants years ago. So eventually I was taking liberal arts courses in college, in prison, and my mind was gradually opening up to new ideas and new ways of looking at things. One day, we were watching a film about the Holocaust. And there was this horrifying scene where this piece of Caterpillar bulldozer equipment pulls up to dead, naked human bodies stacked 4 or 5 high and just bulldozes those bodies into a hole in the ground. That was a moment for me where my lifelong narrative was challenged. And I was forced to see other people as people. People with emotions, people with dreams, people with hopes, aspirations, and tragedy. People like me. I was reminded that human beings have the ability to do a lot of good and the ability to cause a tremendous amount of harm. It was the beginning of a process of internal reconciliation where I came to understand that even though I had not caused actual physical harm when I was committing crimes, that I was causing a tremendous amount of trauma and psychological harm to other people. This is when I also began to recognize a common thread among the people I was locked up with. How much time do I have left? 25? Great. Thank you. In prison, I was surrounded by men whose label was criminal, but who had themselves survived stab wounds, razor slashings, bullet wounds, men who had been robbed, beaten. I found myself sitting in this repository of society's failure to recognize that these men were survivors, as was I. I began to see that the conveyor belt that had delivered us to this horrible place needed to be switched to the off position. We had to slow it down long enough to think about whether the men and women moving inescapably towards a life behind bars, where they would continue to be victims of abuse and a total lack of personal agency, could have been spared that fate. What if their dual status as victim offender had been recognized earlier? As if there had been an intervention to treat their victimization before it turned into the opposite. Looking back at my own life, I can see how things could have turned out differently for me if my own victimization had been recognized, respected, and treated. If I was a more deserving victim. That was a turning point for me. Since prison offered me no room for healing or repairing the harm I had caused, I had to figure out how to start the process on my own. I knew I had to replace my old values with new ones. I'd seen what happened to people whose values had been torn away when they realized the amount of harm they had done, but who didn't have anything to replace it with. Some became suicidal. For some, even a negative belief system is better than no belief system at all. So I began to dig in deep within myself and to do a lot of reading and studying, thinking about how I could repair the damage I had caused. I knew I would never get the chance to engage the actual victims of my crimes because of our binary and adversarial criminal justice system. But I came to believe that by working to end mass incarceration, I could help reduce victimization across this country. And I also knew that I wanted to end the carnage in my own backyard and work to close the torture island that is Rikers. Rikers is now widely recognized as a human rights atrocity, a place where violence and victimization are embedded into the very fabric of the institution, a place that was built 200 feet away from one of the busiest airports in this country, knowing that the flight of the airplanes coming in meant that you'd only build facilities architecturally that are the antithesis of how you'd build a safe jail. And we built 10 of them. The vast majority of people on Rikers, 80%, are pretrial, meaning they have not yet been convicted of a crime, and many will not be convicted of a crime. And yet they're routinely subjected to abuse at the hands of other incarcerated people and the guards. Last year alone, New York City taxpayers spent $13 million settling claims of abuse and wrongful death on Rikers. That's a cost in dollars and in human lives that is shameful. Rikers is a symbol of the worst dysfunction of our criminal justice system. It's a place where the cycle of harm is reinforced and exacerbated rather than interrupted and calmed. One of the most difficult things to do as a community is take ownership of the ways in which we have failed our neighbors, some of whom get labeled victims and some of whom get labeled offenders, and reimagine a system of justice that doesn't treat those categories as mutually exclusive, but instead seeks to make all people whole. Our criminal justice system does a tremendous amount of harm. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the fact that 2/3 of people come out of prison end up returning to the criminal justice system. Conveyor belt justice does a disservice to the victims of crime. It does not provide a space for people to reckon with the harm they have caused to other people, nor does it provide a space for crime victims to heal from their trauma. Instead, it marginalizes everyone. Maintaining momentum. Mass incarceration and criminalization is a national crisis, which was driven primarily by policies at the state and local level. There are roughly 10 people in a state or local jail for every 1 person in the federal system. What this means is that the hope of criminal justice reform lies at the local and state level as well. Despite retrograde policies emanating from DC, we still have the power to maintain momentum and, dare I say, build momentum in the criminal justice reform movement. Local law enforcement leaders and prosecutors throughout the country are now exploring and launching programs to divert people with behavioral and substance abuse problems away from jail and towards supportive services. State legislators and county officials are adopting sensible bail reform measures to end the absurdity and blatant unfairness of locking up people because they can't raise a few dollars to post bail. But the evidence of our success is most clearly seen in the movement emerging out of the grassroots mobilization efforts around the country. People directly impacted by the criminal justice system and advocates have been identifying the ways to reverse our addiction to incarceration and perpetual punishment for decades. Government and other policymakers are now finally catching up. For example, California voters passed Proposition 47 in November 2014, which has led to 15,000 fewer people incarcerated in California's prisons and jails, generating $68 million in savings in the first year to be reallocated to prevention and treatment. California was also the birthplace of the Ban the Box movement, which has now become such a household phrase in the criminal justice arena. But what many people don't realize is that that concept to ban the box didn't come from a legal aid attorney or a reentry social worker or a progressive policymaker. It came from All of Us and None, a grassroots civil and human rights organization in Oakland fighting for the rights of formerly and currently incarcerated people and their families. It was founded by Dorsey Nunn, who had been sentenced to life in the California prison system at the age of 19 and released after serving 13 years. These are just a couple of countless examples of directly impacted people leading the way in guiding the country out of the crisis of mass incarceration. A third example comes directly from my own organization, to talk a little bit more about the Close Rikers campaign. Just 1 year ago, we launched this campaign to close Rikers. As you all know, as I mentioned, Rikers is one of the most notorious jails in this country. It stands as a symbol of everything that's wrong with our criminal justice system. When I was there were 22,000 people. Today, there are 8,000 people there, detained on any given day, 80% not convicted of a crime, 87% people of color. The former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara issued a report in 2014 detailing the culture of violence at Rikers. The routine beatings, stabbings, and razor slashings have earned it that epithet, Torture Island. He talked about how it has a Lord of the Flies-like culture. When I got to Rikers, correctional officers are working in buildings that are linear and long, and there's 50 cells, and I wouldn't want my brother to work in a place where he had to run past 50 cells to break up a fight or to stop an argument. And so you know what the correction officers do? They deputize people who are serving time. The three of you, you're going to help me keep order in this cell block. And once you give away that authority, you never get it back. Decades of this. In the past year, the Close Rikers campaign has grown to a coalition of more than 130 organizations, both in New York City and national. Elected officials, faith leaders, celebrities, and others have joined the thousands of directly impacted people, calling on our progressive Mayor de Blasio, to shut down Rikers once and for all. The New York City Council established an independent commission chaired by Chief Judge Lippman to investigate what to do about Rikers. I'm one of the 27 commissioners on that commission. Rikers has proven that it can't be reformed. The only solution is to create true speedy trial, bail reform, invest in effective pretrial supervision and other diversion programs, and build a smaller, fairer, and more humane criminal justice system, and then close it. Here's my point. Our experience with the Close Rikers campaign in New York City over the past 12 months proves that local reform efforts, especially those that invest in people, are alive and well and thriving. When we first started saying close Rikers, a lot of people looked at us like we were out of our minds. But in just a year, it has gained real traction and is no longer the political third rail. The governor says close Rikers. The controller says close Rikers. 26 council members say close Rikers. The speaker of the council says close Rikers. And most importantly for us, tens of thousands of New Yorkers are starting to say close Rikers. I do want to make one more point about what it is going to take to get us to the finish line to end mass incarceration. To do that, we have to expand the conversation. This is what happens when you deviate from your speech. Beyond nonviolent and serious and non-serious crimes, and embrace the capacity for redemption that exists in all people convicted of serious violent crimes as well. I'm glad I said that up front, actually. It's simple math. Across the country, 54% of the people in state prisons are there for violent offenses. So even if not a single person was incarcerated for a drug offense, a nonviolent property crime, or a public order offense like prostitution or drunk driving, we wouldn't reach our goal of cutting the correctional population in half by 2030. We have to start rethinking the way we respond to violent crime. My crime was armed robbery, so I'm the person that people are most willing to throw away. So to close, our path to ending mass incarceration must include a couple of key components. First, we have to double down on reforms at the state and local level, especially with the current climate in DC. Second, we have to invest in and center the work around the people most directly impacted by the criminal justice system, regardless of the labels we've placed on them, both survivors and those who have caused harm. If we can come together to do these two things, I have no doubt that we'll be able to resist the efforts to take us backwards and begin to heal the sufferings of millions of Americans across the country. Thank you. Do we have 5 minutes for questions?
Are there any questions?
I have a couple. Yes, pleasure to meet you, first of all.
Likewise, thank you.
Very well. For the live stream, right? So my name is Greg Schaefer. I'm a graduate candidate right now with Justice Law and Criminology. I concentrate in public policy, but my undergraduate was very heavily focused on criminology. I had two questions, and one you started to address. But for all the negatives that are associated with Rikers, you specifically said it can't be reformed. But I was wondering, for all the negatives, are there any positives that come out of Rikers that might be lessons learned that can be taken forward to other institutions? And I have a follow-up question also, but I'll let you.
Sure, that's a good question. I appreciate you pushing me on that. The thing about Rikers is that it's shown it's, you know, it's a little bit of history here. Rikers Island was purchased from a guy who used to capture slaves and return them to the South. His last name was Riken, comes from the Riken family. He was the patriarch in that family. New York City purchased the land for $140,000. So there is a history, even before the culture of corrections ended up there, that is actually really oppressive for people who end up there as detainees or even as people convicted of crimes. And then every single mayor over the decades has decided that resources is the way to respond to what the problem is at Rikers, to the point where now we're spending $209,000 per bed per year. And even though we've cut the population in half, the budget has actually doubled during the same period. And if you extrapolate that budget, you realize that operations costs have stayed the same for the last 2 decades. And what you're really seeing is the cost of correction officers negotiating with City Hall to the point where their fringe benefits are actually 100%. I notice it's not answering your question, but you gave me another opening to talk shit about Rikers. So here's what I like about Rikers. There is an amazing horticulture program at Rikers, right smack dead in the middle of the island. Here's what I love about that. People who come from the communities that I grew up in have a hard time seeing themselves in the future. Like, I can't count the amount of people I went to public school with who are dead now on both of my hands. And And so you don't think about your future because you rarely see people getting to that point. And you start living as though the day you're in is probably your last. And yet, if you plant seeds in the ground, you have to wait for them to grow, and you have to start thinking about what a future might look like. And I value the fact that this program, in the middle of all this other madness, affords some people who are there, whether they're convicted of or not, the opportunity to do something that is therapeutic and cathartic and allows them to start thinking about a future. Your other question?
Thank you, yes. And so my other question, if you got to put on a magic hat and take control of Rikers, but you weren't allowed to close it, but instead you had to reform it, what would be, like the crazy project?
You don't work for the de Blasio administration, do you?
But if you had to reform it, out of all the terrible things that you've mentioned, what would be the focal point of your reform, and how can we
Sure.
take that point of reform and associate it with the other prisons and jails across America?
That's a good question. Is there a camera on, by the way? Oh, man. So here's how I'd answer that. Rikers Island started as 82 acres of land. Now it's 420. So we have essentially dredged the land to expand the size of the island to add more and more jails. I would actually continue to do that and attach it to the city in terms of, I think that it is extremely isolated. It's 200 feet away from LaGuardia. If you ever fly in or out of LaGuardia, just take a look out of the window, you'll see it. But I think we should have went further and attached it to the city. There's something about the remoteness of Rikers that reinforces the idea that when you're there, you're not one of us. And that's reinforced for the people who are serving time, but also for correction officers. We have other jails in New York. They don't have the steady flow of abuse. They do have abuse. I'm not, being Pollyannish about this. But when you think of the 42 or so correction officers that have been indicted in the last 48 months or so, 24 months, 36 of them were on Rikers versus the rest being in the borough facilities. And if you just take your Google alert and type in Rikers and then type in the other facilities, you just see the steady flow every day. Almost every single day there's a story, a negative story coming out of Rikers, every day or two. You don't see that in the borough houses. I think it's because when correction officers come out of those facilities, they're in communities. In fact, downtown Brooklyn, you're in one of the wealthiest communities in New York City at this point. There's $2 million condos 200 feet away from that facility. And it makes people behave differently. And people say, well, how do you know that the abusive correction officers won't just suddenly be in the boroughs and causing the same sort of harm? Our correction officers don't have steady stations. They move around. They move around in the borough facilities and on Rikers. But when you cross that one bridge to Rikers, one way on, one way off, there's something about the worst in human beings that it brings out. And when you marry that to the culture, the longstanding culture, you get the sort of abuse that we see. So I'd connect it to the land, first of all. The second thing I would do is create a tremendous amount of transparency. I mean, MacArthur granted all of these local jurisdictions a crap load of resources to reduce the jail population and to reduce racial inequity in their jail system. And New York 1 became one of the 10 sites. And then eventually, when they realized they had to give up data, said, you know what? No, thank you. Keep the money. And so I think our criminal justice system across America needs light, and more light. And more transparency, more data. You look at the European system, there are places in Europe where you have a week where people are literally invited into the prison as guests to see what's happening, to view how they're delivering services and so on. I remember a story from Jeremy Travis, who runs John Jay, when he went to Germany and to visit prisons, and he walks into this guy's cell, and he's with the correction officer, and he sees this metal spoon, and he was like, he has a metal spoon in his cell. It's a metal spaghetti spoon. What's he doing with that? And the correction officer says, oh, he makes spaghetti. And there's something about a system that, I mean, somebody said to me, you should go to college, right? Like, if you're going to be locked up, imagine exposing people to just a tremendous amount of opportunities. First of all, if you're looking for a silver bullet, you're in the wrong field. Like, just move on to something else. There is no silver bullet. We lock up human beings. We're all individualized. And so I think we need to create as many opportunities as possible for people to turn their lives around. I think we need to re-incentivize the way correction officers think of their jobs. And if I had a magic wand, which is what you first asked me, I would not create a job called correction officer. I would not have anyone's income, living, retirement based on the punishment of others. I think the monetization of misery is the biggest mistake we made as a country. I think people should serve as correction officers for 5, 6, 7 years and then move on to other careers. So if I had a magic wand, I'd probably start there, actually.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Tara Chen, and I work at the Public Defender Service for DC in the Community Defender Division. And I just, so your comment about less looking at people who are labeled as a violent offender as being really essential to reducing incarceration at the levels that we really want to see in this country. I think that a lot of people have made that comment. I haven't heard a lot, and I completely agree with it. I haven't heard a lot of suggestions on how we get people to care about people who have committed a quote-unquote violent crime and to believe that they, in fact, are just as valued and are just as capable of being rehabilitated, which I know to be true. A lot of my clients are people who committed those kinds of crimes and are wonderful people who are now doing amazing things when they come back to that community. But, I mean, how do you see getting the wider scene acknowledging that and being engaged on that in terms of the policymakers and the politicians and all the people that have to be a part of that conversation in order to actually get it to work?
That's a great question. So, no pressure, but how many people in this room have served time in prison? So there's a good place to start. Can't humanize people if they're not in the room. Got to see people as human beings by interacting with them, talking with them. Think of the gay rights movement. Think of the labor movement, women's movement. If you didn't meet women and talk to them and hear their struggles, if you didn't talk to folks in labor movement and hear about how oppressed their conditions were. I mean, we used to have hospitals. I'm old enough to remember this. We had hospitals where people with HIV would be right in front of the hospital dying on the doorstep. And because they weren't human, it just didn't matter. It wasn't until we recognized them as humans and said, this is not how we treat sick Americans, that we turned a corner. But that came from people with the disease and with the stigma that comes with it, standing up and saying, I'm human too, here's my experience, and you're not gonna treat me as not human. When I got invited to the White House 2 years ago, it was like the highlight of my career. I get invited to the White House to meet with Valerie Jarrett and Roy Austin, all these folks who report directly to the president. And then I get to the White House and I hand over my ID with 50 of my colleagues who I had been with that entire day. And they all just sort of kept sailing through. And I get this badge that says needs an escort. 21 years after my conviction, black man invited to the White House to have a discussion about mass incarceration, can't get in based on that conviction. And when I finally get in, I shift the conversation in the room, first of all, helping people recognize that I was the only formerly incarcerated person in the room, very similar to the experience we just had 2 minutes ago in this room. And then on the way home, on the train, on the Northeast Corridor, I'm writing a letter to Obama, and I decided in that moment that what was important wasn't Glenn Martin being barred to get into the White House that day. What was important is that that experience mirrored the experience of 70 million Americans who are going into Starbucks to get a job, or McDonald's, or, I mean, I run an agency now with 20 people on staff, a $3.5 million budget. I've run a nonprofit with 212 people reporting to me. I couldn't get a job lifting boxes from here to here when I got out of prison. And that doesn't become real until you hear from the people who've had those experiences. So, and then I'd say this, you know, because in some people's minds, I guarantee you, because we all have a narrative about people who go to prison. We've just been fed that narrative for our entire lives. It's the country we live in. And so even when you hear someone like me saying, you need to bring formerly incarcerated people into the space, I don't care how progressive you are, you have a narrative in your head about what that means. And in some cases, people think like, yeah, that's just not easy to do. And you know what? It's not. It's not. The problem with people with problems is that they act like people with problems. People who are coming out of the criminal justice system have problems. It is our responsibility to respond to that. They didn't create the system that they ended up in, even if they made poor decisions that got them there. I mean, people look at me now like I have the chance to be on CNN and MSNBC, and I'm doing all these amazing things. I meet with the president. I've met with Desmond Tutu and Sandra Day O'Connor, all these amazing people. When I got out of prison, I was making $17,000 a year, and I owed $100,000 in fines, fees, restitution, child support. I was your client. People were willing to deal with that. When I put together my budget as an agency every year, I carve out $30,000 to invest in training for the people who work for me. Half of them are formerly incarcerated. And I recognize that they're going to show up lopsided. They're going to have all these amazing characteristics. They're going to bring the personal experience and that experiential knowledge. I value all of that. And they may not be able to read a budget. And I'm going to teach them how to read a budget. So it's a combination of bringing them into the space and investing in them, recognizing that by definition, people have been marginalized. If you're going to bring them to the center, then they're going to come to the center with the very deficits that come with being marginalized. Thank you. Thanks so much.
We'll take a short break, but first I just wanted to pull in a few points from some of the things that Glenn said. When he referenced Fred Patrick, you notice he's on the agenda, and so later today, you're going to hear about reimagining prisons. And it's something I think that's very vital to our whole conversation. Also something that Glenn talked about that we're wanting to focus on is human dignity, and to bring that human dignity back into the system. Discretion, my theme of discretion. When Glenn said we locked a whole bunch of people up with the Get Tough, that Get Tough, the way we did that was law enforcement and the criminal justice system used their discretion. So now we're asking them to use their discretion to keep people out and to reduce mass incarceration. And then redefining government's role in criminal justice. I think the point to me that stood out in Glenn's talk was that the correctional officer said that he should go to college. So when we think about the role of government in criminal justice, we should think about it differently. And his point about not monetizing profession around punishment. And so that's something we can talk about as redefining the role of criminal justice, the government in criminal justice. So do we want to take a short break? Okay, take a 5-minute break, and then we'll start with our first panel. Thank you.